I was an Emmy Award-winning investigative producer for NBC. He was a brilliant, world-renowned surgeon. And something happened like, bam.
I miss you. I love you so much. I love you. I love you.
He took me to one of the most romantic cities in the world.
On the way to Venice, the motorboat.
Wow! Oh my God. Oh my God.
The message is my love, that I love you so much, and His Highness Pope Francis will marry us.
You're just too good to be true. Can't take my eyes off of you.
Hillary Clinton,
President Obama,
Elton John might be there,
Russell Crowe,
and John Legend.
It was Cinderella all the way. This whole thing was totally a Cinderella story.
Except my story was not going to have a Cinderella ending.
Welcome, Benita Alexander.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So Christmas Day is just around the corner, and on that day, exactly 10 years ago, Paolo Macchiarini proposed to you. Who was that woman in the wedding dress?
You know, when I met Paolo, professionally and personally, I think I was at two very different places. Professionally, I was at the height of my career. I had a very successful career as a producer at NBC News. Personally, I was having a very difficult time. My ex-husband, at the time of about 3 years, had been diagnosed with a very aggressive form of brain cancer, and we knew that he was not going to live very long, and we had our beautiful, then 9-year-old daughter. And I was faced at the time with, how do I tell this little girl that her dad is going to die? How do I, how is this going to impact the rest of her life? How is it going to impact our lives? And I think I was, very, very vulnerable at the time, although I didn't realize it. And that's when Dr. Macchiarini sauntered into my life.
What was your first impression?
Look, then, at the time, this is a man who's incredibly charming. He's one of those people that walks into a room and just commands the room. He has a presence about him. He's intelligent, he's worldly, he's sophisticated, he's classy, he speaks 5 or 6 different languages. Add on top of that, the work he was doing. He was very intriguing and very admirable. I mean, this is a man who was a medical pioneer. He was doing work that nobody else in the world was doing. He was taking risks that nobody else in the world was willing to take. He worked here at Karolinska, the place that awards the Nobel Prize in Medicine. There were rumors that he was in contention for a Nobel Prize. So he was kind of bigger than life. And he seemed, at the time, to be incredibly humble and incredibly caring. I mean, you really thought that he wanted to change medicine, that he wanted to change the world. And that was, very intriguing and appealing.
I mean, you were doing a story about him. He allowed you to come with him when he was doing surgeries. At the same time, you were falling in love with him. How did he make you feel?
Well, that was at the end. That coincided at the very end. We were finishing. I was doing a documentary, not so much about him, but about regenerative medicine, which is the type of work he was doing. And then after my ex-husband did pass away is when the romance first started. And I think what happened is I was vulnerable, and what happens when you're vulnerable? You want somebody to wrap their arms around you and tell you that everything's going to be okay.
Yeah. How did he court you?
Oh my gosh. I mean, it was, which in hindsight, honestly, should have been my first clue. It's classic love bombing. It was romance on steroids. I mean, but in the moment, it was magical. I was floating on clouds. He flew me all over the world. Everywhere we went, it was, elaborate bouquets of roses, flowers, flower petals on the floor, champagne, the best champagne in the room, the best restaurants, the best everything always. He was always surprising me. Money was not his motive. A lot of these con artists, they want money. This was not the case. He was exceedingly generous, not just with me, my family, my friends, everybody. And everybody was sitting on the edge of their seat. I would come home from trips and people were like, what did he do now? What did he do now? And people were jealous. People would say that we had renewed their hope in love. It just felt like a beautiful love story. It started as a beautiful love story.
But you were close. You dated for 2 years.
Almost 2 years.
Yeah. And during this time, he went from being a world-renowned surgeon to being openly questioned by several of his colleagues, including here at Karolinska. How did he confide in you about that stress?
No. For a little while during our relationship, he kept alluding to one person in particular that had a vendetta against him. He said he had this one colleague who was out to get him down, take him down. And he would whine and complain about this guy all the time. And he said, this man wants to destroy my career, and he's jealous, and he's envious, and it's a witch hunt. And so I took him at his word. I believed him. The first sign of trouble was late 2014. We were supposed to get married in July of 2015. And this article came out in the New York Times about the allegations of scientific misconduct. That was the first hint I had of anything being wrong. And I was furious because I had to read about it in the New York Times, and Paolo hadn't said anything to me, and I'm his fiance. But I believed him. I'm his loving fiance. I did what any loving partner or fiance would do. I supported him.
And at the same time, you're planning your wedding, July 11th, 2015.
Right.
What made you most excited about that date?
Not all the things that you might think, not all the grandiose things. I would have married him on a beach, I didn't want this big, fancy, grand wedding. This was all designed by Paolo. And it started with him saying that he wanted to get married in Italy, where his mother was. He wanted to get married close to where his mother was, and he wanted a big Catholic wedding. I'm not even Catholic. So the first thing I said to him was, well, how's that going to work? I don't know a lot about the Catholic religion, but I do know that they frown on divorcees getting married in the Catholic Church, and we're both divorced, or so I thought. And he made a very clever move very early on, and he said, I want to surprise you with everything. Now, keep in mind, this is a man that had surprised me with elaborate surprises all through our relationship. And he said, I don't want you to ask any questions. I'm going to do everything. All you have to do is get your dress and pick out the invitations, leave the rest to me. It was not an easy decision for me. I'm a producer. I'm kind of a control freak. And honestly, I don't know any woman that doesn't want to be involved in the planning of her own wedding. So I reluctantly agreed. But all my friends and my family said, you know what? He has incredible taste. He will do this right. For once in your life, step back, let somebody take over. And there was this very slow, calculated, I now understand, weaving of this web of lies. So first it was, he couldn't find a church for us to get married in because no Catholic priest in Italy would marry two divorcees. And then it was, well, I'm going to go to the Vatican and ask them for help. And
because he said that he knew the Pope.
Yes, and as ridiculous as that sounds, and believe me, I know how ridiculous it sounds. I'm sure there are people in the audience, and I don't question any of you, who think, come on, really? You believe this nonsense? I get it. I probably would have said the same thing if I was in your shoes. But he said that he was the Pope's private personal doctor. He also said that, these people, like the Pope and other dignitaries, want private doctors because they don't want all their personal business aired in public. I talked to people that know celebrities or are friends with celebrities, and they all said, yes, this happens. They have their own personal network of doctors. Then he goes to the Vatican, ostensibly, to ask for help finding a priest that will marry us. But that's when everything went crazy. He comes out of this meeting, and he calls me, and he tells me that, yes, he got someone to help us. And, oh, by the way, I met with Pope Francis himself, and he wants to marry us himself. And the first thing I said is bullshit, I said, come on, don't be stupid, And I thought he was pulling my leg. And the first thing I did is I went to the computer, literally typed in, does the Pope marry people? Because I said, the Pope doesn't marry people. As it turned out, the Pope had, the month prior, or 2 months prior, married 20 couples at the Vatican, all of who were, quote unquote, living in sin, had kids out of wedlock or whatever. So I thought, okay, so the Pope can marry people if he wants to. And from there, it just went crazy.
The guest list.
Yeah, and I kept saying to Paolo, do you realize what a big story this is going to be? And I didn't want any part of it, I said I'd rather go get married on a beach. But what he did, which was very clever, he convinced me that this was kind of my duty, that because he was the Pope's private personal doctor, and because this forward-thinking Pope had this agenda to open up the Catholic Church and change the world, that he had chosen Paolo to help him do that. He wanted to do Paolo a favor by, finding him someone that would marry us. And it was Paolo's turn to do the Pope a favor. And therefore, by virtue of being his partner, I had to do this. So it was no longer about us and our wedding. It was presented to me as kind of an obligation. This is something you have to do. It doesn't matter to you. You're not Catholic. It matters to the rest of the world. And then once the Pope was marrying us, all these celebrities and dignitaries were invited because it was going to be this huge ordeal. And, you know, world leaders, Andrea Bocelli was supposed to be singing as I was walking down the aisle. You know, the Obamas were invited. All these people he claimed he was the private personal doctor to.
But I mean, then you found out that it was a lie because the Pope wasn't even going to be in Italy on the day of your wedding.
Unfortunately, there's a reason they have that saying, love is blind. I thought I was riding off into the sunset with him. I was giving up everything. I quit my job of 17 years. I pulled my daughter out of her very difficult to get into school. We thought we were moving to Barcelona. And so these things were starting to sort of rise up, but I think I kept sort of going like this. And we were arguing about a lot of things in the 6 months preceding the wedding. I had never been to Barcelona. He had flown me all over the world, but I had never been to the house in Barcelona where we were supposed to be living after the wedding. I mean, who does that? You know, and we argued about this all the time. I said, who the hell marries a man without seeing the house where they're going to live? This is ridiculous. And so I think all these things were here, and there were things about that wedding that just were not adding up anymore. You know, I mean, yes, he was surprising me, but my guests were asking me questions. We had 300 people flying from all over the world who had bought plane tickets, who had bought fancy red carpet attire for this wedding. They're asking me, where are we staying? How are we getting from the airport to the hotel? I asked Paolo for answers. He won't give me answers. So things were just not making sense. And then I get this email the day after I left my job at NBC, and it was a very simple email from a colleague. The subject line just said, the Pope. And it was a link to an article that said the Pope was going to be in South America on July 11th, and that the trip had been planned for a very long time. And the moment I read that article, it's just like lightning went off. I mean, I felt sick. I felt like somebody punched me in the stomach. I almost honestly passed out. And in that moment, I did not yet have all the details, but I knew then. I knew that he was lying to me about everything. You know, I just knew. And that began, I guess I kind of woke up out of my love haze, you know, and I pulled out my journalist hat, put it back on, and I went into hyper investigative mode. You know?
And then you started investigating him. You contacted Karolinska.
Oh yeah, I did everything. I hired a private investigator just because I knew I was too close to it, and I wanted somebody to back me up, even though I am an investigative producer. And I also did not tell him what I was doing because I knew that he was not going to tell me the truth, and I wanted to have all the information, you know, indisputable, hard evidence before I confronted him. Because one of the things that he's so good at doing is squashing any doubt you have. And I think this goes beyond me. This happened at Karolinska. It happened with everybody that he fooled. He's very good at making you question yourself. So if I said to him, this doesn't make sense, you know, it's rapid fire, boom, 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 and why? I'm not lying to you. Why would I lie to you? And bam, 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 and he has the facts, bam, bam, bam. So you start doubting yourself. You think, oh, okay, you know, it must be me. And so I had to kind of play this game with him where I started lying to him. You know, I'm still telling him I loved him, which made me sick, but I'm investigating him. So I spent months. I found out in May, and I'm gathering all this information, and very quickly, you know, all the phone calls that I could have made all along, you know, I start making the phone calls. You know, nothing about the wedding was true. It was literally nothing. It was a complete, sick, twisted fantasy. There was no wedding planned ever. You know, all the venues he said were booked, everything. None of it, they'd never heard of us. They didn't know what I was talking about. The Vatican basically laughed at me. You know, he's not the Pope's private personal doctor. None of these people he said he was friends with. He said he was friends with Bill Clinton, you know, blah, blah, blah. All complete nonsense, bullshit, some sick, twisted fantasy in his head. So he makes up this entire fabricated fantasy wedding. He lets people buy plane tickets, you know, for God's sake, book hotels, you know, spend all this money. It's not just me who spent money. Now it's all my friends and family who have spent money. And just everything was lie. I mean, literally everything. Nothing was true. But the last piece of the puzzle for me was Barcelona. I mean, there had to be a damn good reason he'd never taken me to Barcelona, right? And so I went there myself. And what I found in that house in Barcelona was he was hiding another family. And this is not the Italian wife that he hadn't divorced. This is another woman and 2 young children. So a whole secret family. So that was 3 families, me and my daughter, the wife in Italy, and the family in this house. And in that moment, I just fell apart. I just lost it. And
when you realized that he lives there with a woman
in the house where I was supposed to be moving, in the house where my daughter thought, he had sat in front of my daughter, this little girl who had just lost her dad. He literally sat in front of her talking about her life in Barcelona and the school he had enrolled her in Barcelona and the life, you know, none of it's true. How you do that is beyond me. Literally none of it was true. So then I actually, when I went to the house in Barcelona, I had planned to get out of the car and go and confront him. He also told me that morning that he was in Russia. And then so the first thing, when I see him coming down the stairs, I stayed in the car. And the moment I saw him, I was videotaping myself and I just started swearing, like, you're not in fucking Russia, asshole, you know. And then I wanted to go down and confront him, but once I saw those little children, I couldn't get out of the car, you know. These are innocent little children, you know, and I didn't want to make anything worse for them. So I sent him a text about this long, you know, just calling him every name under the sun, telling him, you lied to blah, 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 blah. He literally wrote back one word, wow.
Wow, indeed.
Just wow. Because he was caught. And what could he say? Just wow.
I mean, he's obviously not here to give his version. We've reached out to Paolo Macchiarini through his lawyer, but we haven't heard back. So he has had a chance to comment, but hasn't. But now he is also sentenced to prison here in Sweden, 2.5 years, not for what he did to you, but what he did to his patients. How do you feel about him going to jail?
I've been on this mission for far longer than I imagined. I thought initially I was just going to put my story out there and that would be it. It was never about revenge. It wasn't about spite. It wasn't even about telling my own story. It was about justice and what's right. And so finally, you know, fast forward all these years, we have some semblance of justice. I don't think the prison term is long enough, but I am very happy for his patients' sake that there is some semblance of justice. That is the least they deserve.
You've shared a picture with us. Can you tell us what this is?
Oh, yes, this is interesting. You know, I was here in court last year for his trial and then again this year for the appeals trial. And he paints this picture of himself in court like, woe is me. You know, he's downtrodden. The world is against him. He's, you know, what he always does. He's, in his opinion, he's never done anything wrong. All he ever wanted to do was help his patients. He keeps pushing this agenda. And he basically said he's broke and he's destroyed and he's got, you know, no life. Not true. A woman contacted me and she was working with him in 2019 on a cruise ship.
He is on this, he is the doctor on this cruise ship.
So he was on this cruise ship working as the head doctor on a cruise ship. She was his head nurse. She told me that when he arrived on the cruise ship, he said, I'm Dr. Paolo Macchiarini. I'm the most famous doctor in the world. And everybody kind of went, you know, they didn't know who he was. And he also said, my wife died 2 months ago, and painted this whole picture of himself being a widow to garner sympathy. Classic. And she very kind of quickly figured out that something was wrong and then found out about me and contacted me.
It's been a long time since he broke your heart. Has it been mended?
Yeah, look, I don't think you can go through something like this and not have trust issues. I think it's impossible. And this is something that I tell women all the time now. But I made a very concerted decision when this happened to me to not allow him to change me and not allow him to change the essence of who I am. I'm a diehard romantic. I always will be. But I didn't want to give him that power. You know, he did enough. You know, he hurt me enough. He hurt my daughter enough. And I decided that I would not let him change me. And I've worked very hard to not let that happen. And I think I've been successful. And I am now in a very healthy relationship with a very lovely man. So, yes.
I'm happy for you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming here and telling your story. Benita Alexander.
Thank you for having me.
Hela historien om Paolo Macchiarini hör ni i P3 Dokumentär, skandalkirurgen Macchiarini och de dödliga experimenten.